Welcome to Glass Half Full with Leslie Krongold. She shares her stories, experiences, and knowledge of living and coping with a chronic health condition. Learn about tools and resources and hear inspirational interviews that help you to live a life filled with quality and dignity. With 2 decades of support group leadership, Leslie's ready to help you make lemonade out of life's lemons. Are you ready?
Hello. If you've been a listener to this podcast for a while, you probably know I'm a big fan of yoga. There are several episodes about yoga, the science of yoga, yoga for cancer survivors, yoga for healthy aging with Dr. Baxter Bell, and accessible yoga. 2 years ago, I interviewed Jivana Heyman, who coined the term accessible yoga. Jivana has been training yoga instructors for several years on how to make yoga more accessible. Shortly before I interviewed him, I attended one of his accessible yoga conferences in New York. He spreads the accessible yoga gospel all over the world, so New York was easier to get to than like Greece or Italy. I really enjoyed the experience, so when the conference came to San Francisco the following year, I went to that one as well. And then this past March, I saw Jivana was doing a yoga teacher training for 3 days in San Francisco. I don't know what came over me, because I am not a yoga teacher, nor do I plan to become one, but I wanted to challenge myself, and I'm so glad I did. One of the significant differences between a general conference and a teacher training is that the conference has a couple hundred attendees, and you take an hour class, one teacher, and then another class with a different teacher. It's a great opportunity to see a variety of styles, and it's fun. But a teacher training is intense. There were only about, 15 of us in a room for 3 days, 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Just the time commitment was a challenge for me. And I was quick to tell everyone that I was not a teacher, nor did I want to teach. Everyone in attendance was already a yoga teacher, having studied for 200 plus hours elsewhere. This training, I believe, was 30 hours, with the sole purpose of making whatever everyone was already teaching more accessible to students. It wasn't a particular style of yoga. It was an opening of the mind to see how little adjustments here and there could make yoga available to others, whether they had mobility challenges, had larger bodies, or any type of limitation that prevented them from having a healing yoga experience. For this podcast episode, I've talked with 3 yoga teachers I've met through the accessible yoga events I've attended. The first is Rose Kress, who taught one of the classes I attended at the San Francisco conference. Rose lives in Oregon, recently relocated from Arizona, and is the owner-director of LifeForce Yoga. Her work focuses on mood management. Next, you'll hear from Erica Lynn and Clarissa Hidalgo. I met Erica and Clarissa in the teacher training. Erica started a program called Big Bliss Yoga, catering to bigger bodies, and Clarissa's yoga practice stems from her early diagnosis of multiple sclerosis. Each of these women has made yoga accessible for different audiences. At the end, you'll hear more from Rose about yoga therapy, yoga Nidra, and mudras, or hand gestures. I invite you to visit the Glass Half Full website for links to each of the teachers' websites, as well as a YouTube video of a yoga Nidra session. So, let's start with Rose. I asked her when she began practicing yoga.
I took my first yoga class in 1994, and a friend of mine from high school was like, oh, hey, there's this thing called yoga, you want to go try it? So we tried it, and I part of me was hooked immediately, and I practiced a little. I bought a book and then started going to yoga classes, and I was in and out of yoga classes during the years, and then in 2002 I was really kind of in a low place. And so I just decided, well, I feel good when I do yoga, so I need to do yoga. So I committed to a 7 a.m. yoga class 3 times a week, and so it's been consistent since 2002.
When did you become a teacher?
I taught my first yoga class in 2004. I was in Taiwan on a program for Buddhism, because I was really studying and heavily into Buddhism, and might have even called myself a Buddhist at that time, but still practicing yoga. And the people in the group were like, well, you have the most regular yoga practice. You really know yoga, so would you teach us a yoga class? And I thought, okay. And so I just did. And it was during the teaching of the yoga class that I was like, I feel most like myself. I feel so comfortable doing this, and this feels so right. So I came home and decided I need to take a yoga teacher training, and ended up doing that my final semester of college. And my history is I have a diagnosis of both obsessive compulsive disorder and post-traumatic stress disorder from my youth. So anxiety was really how I operated in the world. And obsessive compulsive disorder, it had its ebbs and flows in terms of the severity of my experience, but I was using yoga. Unbeknownst to me, I was actually using yoga to kind of soften some of that, but I had basically was resigned to the thought, the belief that I would always have obsessive compulsive disorder. I would always be excessively anxious, and nothing would change about that. So as I started going to a regular yoga class, and it just happened to be Amy Weintraub at the gym. It wasn't pre-planned. It wasn't thought out. That was the teacher teaching at the time that I had decided to go, because I was in college and had classes
where was
the
this?
rest of the day. This was just at a Tucson Racket and Fitness Club.
Oh, okay.
It was a gym, so I'm always partial to gym yoga. When people talk about gym yoga not being the best yoga, I'd say, I had my most profound life-changing experience with yoga in a gym. Both times it was at a gym, my first experience, and then again, the experience that really shifted my path and my future was inside of a gym. So gyms can have profound yoga in them. So I always speak about gyms that way. Don't write it off, because you never know what you'll find there. So Amy was doing, she was writing Yoga for Depression when I started taking the class. I didn't know she was writing that book, but that's what she was really doing. So there was a lot of talk in the class about depression, and more depression, because we were, from the mental health standpoint, there was a lot more about depression 15, 20 years ago. Now the shift is really about anxiety and trauma. So when I graduated, that was language that I was comfortable with. That's kind of where my focus went. And then by that point, I was working with Amy, working for her business and teaching in her, at that point, brand new training program of LifeForce Yoga practitioner training. So I had this bent of, I want to do yoga that works for mood issues, and I want to help people with physical issues with yoga, because I also had some physical issues. I was struggling with chronic pain, which, well, obviously that was the MS, the multiple sclerosis, that I wasn't aware of at the time. Now I can look back and go, oh, okay, that's what was going on with me. That's why I experienced that pain and that particular kind of fatigue in my body. So it's always been both mental health and chronic pain issues and physical injury has been my focus. And my specific, over time, I came to understand that the population I love working with the most are people that have no yoga experience and are not your typical quote-unquote yoga bodies. That's who I love to work with, and to give them just these moments of freedom experiences that they otherwise wouldn't experience because they might not go to a regular yoga class. Because they've seen the pictures, or they've seen the videos, or they, I'm not, as I hear all the time, well, I'm not a pretzel, and I can't do that pretzel stuff. Mm-hmm. To which my response is, well, that's good. I'm not a baker. The yoga would be great for you.
Mm-hmm. I asked Rose about her experience teaching at the Accessible Yoga Conference where I met her.
It was a real deep, heartfelt community connecting at this heartfelt level, and also this place of freedom where people were showing up as, this is what constricts me on a physical level, but it doesn't constrict me on a spiritual level, mm-hmm. or an emotional level. Or this is why constriction on an emotional level, but here I am physically open. So the deeper connections in that place where, there wasn't the person who, used the cane over in the corner because they couldn't integrate. So I think that sense of welcoming everybody as they were, and that this is a community where we see beyond disabilities or skin color or emotional disabilities, or whatever labels we want to put on those things. It's like the labels went away, and people were interacting with each other as people again, which you don't often see that.
We'll return to my conversation with Rose in a few minutes. Now I'd like to introduce Erica, whom I met at the Accessible Yoga Teacher Training this past March. Erica lives in Pacific Grove, which is near Monterey, California, a very beautiful part of the coast. I asked Erica about her early yoga experiences. She was living in Fresno, California, and her dietitian suggested she check out a yoga class.
My first class was restorative yoga, and I went and I loved it, and I've been hooked ever since.
So did you have an idea, like some kind of image of what yoga was, and it turned out to be totally different than what you thought it would be?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think what is common that people think about yoga is that it's going to be some fierce looking, tall, skinny, white people, women doing, really fancy poses and really fancy postures. And I just felt in a bigger body I wasn't going to fit in. Luckily, my dietitian at the time, she knew the studio well and knew that was not what they were about, and suggested I went to a restorative class, which helped me go. Because when you look at how a restorative class is marketed, it's more about breathing and gentle postures. And I think what sold it for me, like the first few minutes as I was getting checked in, I remember the woman was telling me that they like to call it nap time yoga. And I was like, okay. And that just reassured me that I was going to be okay. Mm-hmm. And it turned out to be, I still talk about this because I feel like I learned how to breathe. Mm-hmm. And I took my first deep breath in years just with that one class.
I asked Erica what led her to a yoga teacher training program.
But I did. I went through it and I got my certification in 2015, not ever with the intention that I was going to teach in a million years. I just wanted to do it to expand my own practice, which it did. And then it kind of morphed later into teaching.
So when you first went to that restorative class in 2011, if someone had said, Erica, you're going to teach yoga in a few years, would you have laughed in their face?
I totally just laughed, and I'm like, I would have just said, do you see any other fat yoga teachers that exist? Because I don't. And I wish I could have said that out loud, because I know the owner would have told me, this is why we need you to take teacher training. You know, and that's why I eventually started teaching, because I realized there was just such a lack of, you know, my type of body, my bigger body represented in yoga studios, let alone in the teacher world, the yoga teacher world. Yeah, no, I would have just laughed out loud if someone would have said that I would be teaching one day. When I first started teaching, I was teaching a regular weekly class when I lived in Sacramento, and that was the first time I taught, and it was called Big Bliss, for bigger bodied students, for fat bodies, bigger bodies, larger bodies, however you want to say it, but it was specifically for that demographic. And I had a great turnout and met a lot of nice people and got some really cool regulars, and some of which are still really close friends. I teach workshops, and the workshops are also called Big Bliss. So I do those every couple months. I do another one, and they're 2.5-hour workshops, and they're also geared towards larger bodies. And it's all about just how to use props, how to, you know, work with variations to poses, how to just really simple things like child's pose can be, you know, said so often in a yoga class, in a mainstream yoga class, but just rest in child's pose. Well, that's not a pose that's really comfortable for a lot of people for many reasons, but especially people in bigger bodies, you know, with tummies and bellies and boobs and things getting in the way. And so showing, you know, the workshop's about showing them how to use a bolster and how to use blankets and how to use blocks to prop themselves up to be more comfortable in a pose. I've just been so passionate about teaching the Big Bliss workshops and classes that I decided to offer a retreat in January here in Pacific Grove over a weekend. And because there's a lot of yoga retreats in the world, and there's very few retreats targeted toward larger bodies. Mm-hmm. So that's what I'm doing, is tailoring a retreat specifically towards large bodies for all genders. It'll be really good, and I'm really super stoked about putting that on and just offering it and seeing what happens.
I was surprised to discover that a few of the yoga teachers at the training also had chronic health conditions. One of those teachers is Clarissa Hidalgo, who has multiple sclerosis. She came from the Central Valley of California for the training. I asked Clarissa about her entry to a yoga practice.
So I've had MS since I was 19. I've been going to UCSF. You know, I go about every 6 months, a year. And I was there for my biannual checkup with my neurologist. And while I was there, I happened to meet a man who was from the same town that I was from, which is very rare to find someone in the Central Valley in San Francisco. So I I met him. He had MS too. We just got to talking. We figured out we were from the same area. And he started talking to me about yoga and how yoga had really helped his symptoms. And, he really loved it, and he begged for me to try it. At that time, I wasn't driving. I had put a 9 up on my car because my symptoms were rather erratic. And he was like, no, I'll pick you up. Don't worry about it. So he started picking me up and taking me to yoga with him. And at first I started just once a week doing classes specially designed for people with MS. And I slowly built my strength. I got a grant from the MS Society for a year-long unlimited yoga class pass. basically it's just kind of history from there. I mean, I gained my strength. I got my car back. I went back to grad school. I was in grad school at the time, but I ended up dropping out. But still, it was just this path. It was just this path that came to me through my diagnosis of MS.
Clarissa eventually attended a 10-month yoga teacher training program.
So slowly I started working with one of my really close friends in home. Started doing privates with her. And from the privates, I guess you could say I just really realized, like, wow, I love this. I love doing this. And so I started slowly teaching classes. I decided right away that classes were not for me, that I was more attuned to the private side. And so slowly I just started getting calls and recommendations, and it just kind of turned into something that, people just asked for, I guess you could say.
So mostly you do one-on-ones?
I do mostly private work, although I am contracted with Dignity Health to begin classes with them. I do work with women, infants, and children, prenatal classes with them. But for the majority, yes, most of my work is private.
And are most of your clients, do they have MS or some sort of chronic health condition?
A little bit of it all. A little bit of it all. So I have clients with fibromyalgia, degenerative disc disease. I have several clients with MS as well, but arthritis, cerebral palsy, just anything you can imagine. And then there's the adaptive yoga class that I teach at Suka Studios in Modesto. That one, we have a whole range of people who come in. Everyone from people just having a bad day to people in wheelchairs. And I have private clients in wheelchairs as well. And everyone can do yoga, so it's just all around the board.
Rose is a yoga therapist, so I asked her how yoga therapy and accessible yoga intersect.
I think that yoga therapy is accessible yoga, and a lot of people doing yoga therapy, 200-hour yoga teacher training really gives you the basics for teaching yoga, but you don't get a lot of the specific awarenesses about working with specific populations. For example, a yoga therapy training is 800 hours long. And so within those 800 hours, you really get to delve into the depths of issues and the struggles that people have. Yoga therapy and accessible yoga, from my perspective, are so interwoven. And in many ways, I think they can be one and the same, caveat being honoring scope of practice and certifications and all of that. And then yoga therapy, I think it can have its own constrictions around it as well, like being caught up in using the yoga language, which can make it less accessible. So yoga therapy, just from a basic standpoint, is about working with an individual, and it's not about using yoga poses necessarily. And I've worked with some people where we never do yoga postures at all because that's not why they're working with me. We may be doing another yoga technique like a yoga nidra and really working on the yoga nidra, or we might just be doing movement that doesn't even look like yoga poses because that's just where they are.
How would you describe yoga nidra? Who is it most therapeutic for?
I've been talking about yoga nidra as the crown jewel of yoga, and it's one of the most exquisite practices in yoga. And I believe that yoga nidra is maybe even one of the most accessible practices in yoga because for those people that don't know what a Yoga Nidra practice is, you essentially lie down and press play. And then you're guided through the practice. People struggling with mood issues and struggling for mental health and, well, mental wealth. And so a really good example of that is when we're feeling really, really anxious, or we're really stressed out, or there's a lot going on, the thing we most need is that restorative practice that Yoga Nidra can provide for us. But if you're really stressed out and anxious and your mind is going a mile a second, the last thing that you're going to be able to do is lie down and focus and practice a meditation practice, because Yoga Nidra is at its core a meditation practice. So how do we get somebody who's really struggling with anxiety to practice something that's so good? So we do things like burning off some of that excess energy, and then just altering how we might lead the Yoga Nidra practice to work with somebody who's struggling with anxiety. So how you're using your language, how you're using your pacing. A really good example of a piece of the practice of Yoga Nidra is the body scan. And so in somebody who's really experienced at meditation and Yoga Nidra, whose mind is clear and focused, we might use a pacing like, sense your lips, feel the lips, luxuriate in the lips, right? And really spending some time there with a slower language. Whereas somebody who's more anxious, the pacing might be sense the lips, the top lip, the bottom lip, the roof of the mouth, the floor of the mouth. Really focus on the feeling of the tongue. So the pacing is faster, and we're moving things through the body scan faster because the mind is jumping so fast it can barely focus on one sentence. So who benefits from Yoga Nidra? Every single person on the whole planet benefits from Yoga Nidra. And to me, it's even more accessible because you can download them. And I put a free Yoga Nidra up on YouTube. So you can just go to YouTube and look up a LifeForce Yoga Nidra, and off you go. You're practicing for free.
Okay.
With no ads. There's no ads on that Yoga Nidra. So no interruptions. So, it's a portable practice. I think of accessible yoga as also portability. So how do we take a practice from yoga, and we know yoga is so good, obviously we're talking about yoga, we believe that it's so good, but how do we make that practice portable? How can I do a yoga practice on an airplane? How can I do a yoga practice in my office? I've had clients doing a yoga practice in the bathroom because that's the only private place that they have at their workspace to take a moment to get in touch. And that's what yoga really is. It's about reconnecting with your sacred sense of self. And then when we're connected, then we can act with clarity and ease in the world. And how many of us actually do that before we act? Very few. We've forgotten the tools that we had, and we're so distracted by everything. And I'm not saying I'm always acting that way. I fully admit that a lot of times I forget to connect with my authentic sense of self before I act in the world. And I know I've forgotten because I might be getting into trouble a little bit.
I remembered Rose teaching mudras, or hand gestures, in the class I attended, so I asked her about these. You may not be familiar with yoga mudras because so many teachers don't include these, but for the most part, they are quite accessible.
Mudra means seal, and I like to call them hand gestures, and that's really what we call them in LifeForce Yoga because we're all about making it accessible, and who knows what a mudra is, but a hand gesture, well, I've got my favorite driving hand gesture, right? And so a mudra it's accessible. We could call it pocket yoga because some of these you can, do with your hands in your pocket. And it's a perfect example of one. It's called the Adi Mudra, which Adi means first. And it's where you take your thumb and you place your thumb in your palm and you wrap your fingers around your thumb to your ability level. It might be real loose, and you don't want to squeeze the thumb too hard, but just so that there's touch of fingers on the thumb. And then the hands rest on the thighs. And this mudra is the hand gesture for working with anxiety. And so I was teaching this hand gesture as a part of a yoga therapy protocol, yoga therapy class that I was asked to deliver at a treatment facility for post-traumatic stress disorder and substance abuse at the VA hospital in Tucson. So I spent a year doing that. And so I would bring that practice in, and I would share with the students, this is a really great hand gesture to use if you're having trouble going to sleep at night, or if you're feeling triggered, if you're feeling anxious. And in their case, they were in house meetings and group meetings. And those can get kind of intense. You're living in a facility with a bunch of other people who are really struggling and really working through issues of trauma and substance abuse. So those meetings can get quite intense. And I just suggested, take this hand gesture, you can use it, and just have your hands resting on your legs under the table. And this can help you come back to yourself. And we had done a meditation about finding a sense of groundedness and presence. That was part of the practice every time. And one of the patients came to me and said, I use this all the time in the meetings. It's the one thing that has really meant the most to me from this practice because it helps me come back to myself when I get triggered. And that, to me, is such a powerful example of how a hand gesture can work. It takes me back to me when I feel disconnected. And that's what yoga is.
My hope is to broaden your understanding of yoga. It's not just about pretzel-like poses. There are many aspects to the practice. In fact, there are 8 limbs or areas of traditional yoga. While one area of yoga may not be accessible to you, another area can be. So check out the links I've included in the podcast notes on the Glass Half Full website. And while you're there, you might want to scroll down the page to see the tags. And there's a tag for yoga. So you click on that tag and you can view all of the relevant blog posts and listen to other podcast episodes about yoga. It's, yoga is my main treatment modality for myotonic dystrophy. So thanks for listening.
Thank you for listening to Glass Half Full. Leslie invites you to leave a rating and review on iTunes. This helps spread the word to others dealing with chronic health issues. For show notes, updates, and more, visit the website glasshalffull.online. Glasshalffull.online.